There is a well-known expression called home sweet home. For the audience, it conveys a traditional family scene of a nuclear family grouped around the piano, singing in harmony as father tinkles on the ivories. To some extent it is true. Families did congregate around the parlour piano and sing such songs together, as well as in local pubs too. Today the family would be glued to their mobile telephones, and the idea of a family communal singing has disappeared. Oh, society has changed over the years, for better or for worse, depending upon your viewpoint. For one family in Easton, just off the centre of Bristol, in 1900, the scene was pure fantasy. A family with 6 children, dependent on a seriously alcoholic mother and part-time prostitute, would be described in modern parlance as a dysfunctional one. Also, the father suffered from delirium tremens as a result of constant alcohol abuse. It was destined to end in tragedy, as James will relate.
In the early morning of Friday the 4th of May at 193 Pennywell Road, after her husband Edward had left for work, Mary Pembury was still half asleep in bed when she heard irregular footsteps on the stairs, accompanied by groaning sounds. Apprehensively, she watched as the door opened to reveal her sister-in-law Ellen, dressed in her nightclothes. She lived next door at 191 with her husband Henry and their 6 children. Ellen was struggling to stand upright and was clutching her throat with her hands as blood seeped through her fingers, collapsing to the floor. The Pembury's lodger, Elizabeth Granger, having heard the commotion, rushed into the room to witness the scene and immediately ran downstairs and out into the street to summon help, and saw Henry Milstead, Ellen's husband, leaving his house. "You've killed your wife," shouted Mrs. Granger at him. To her surprise, Milstead calmly turned to her and said that he had, and that he was on his way to give himself up to the police. A passer-by, by the name of Thomas Pacey, who had heard the exchange, rushed into the house through the open front door and ran upstairs to see if he could be of assistance. Sadly, he couldn't. Ellen had died from her wounds where she lay on the floor, with Mary in floods of tears over her dead body. He quick-wittedly rushed back down to the street and began to follow Milstead up the road. Eventually catching him up, he asked Milstead why he had done it and got the reply, "I could not help it. I had to do it." The 2 men quietly continued walking as if nothing had happened, exchanging occasional bits of conversation. One thing that was revealed was that Milstead had 6 children, and maintained that he had not harmed them, nor would he. They continued on their way to Bridewell Police Station, in the centre of the city, where Milstead explained to the sergeant on duty what he had done, and was unsurprisingly immediately arrested. During the intervening period of time, the police had been called, and 3 of them arrived at 193 to find the dead body of Ellen. As there was no doctor present, an ambulance was summoned by one of the officers to take the deceased to the Bristol hospital, where she was pronounced dead on arrival. The other 2 policemen went, with some trepidation, to investigate the house next door. It was in a poor state, and the children wore rags. When the police entered, they were met by one of the boys, who took the officers to his parents' bedroom, where they found a shoemaker's knife with fresh blood on the blade. The bedsheets also had traces of blood. This must have been where Ellen had been attacked. Thankfully, the children were all safe. The coroner's inquest concluded that Ellen Milstead had died from having her throat cut with a shoemaker's knife that had been recovered from the scene, and that it had been inflicted by her husband Henry, and added that when it came to the Assizes Court for trial, that it should be considered wilful murder. Drink was certainly not unknown in many households in those days, but domestic abuse amounted to unpleasant stories of unwarranted violence, but not murder. For this, we have to look into the domestic background to see what exactly happened. Henry Milstead was a 44-year-old shoemaker who worked for a local company. Ellen, his wife of some years, had a severe alcohol problem for over a decade that was so bad that she would use all the money that she could find to fund her habit. She also worked part-time in a local brothel to supplement her income, and also resorted to stealing. The house was squalid, and the children wore threadbare clothes. To assist her habit, she spent every penny her husband made on drink, despite his pleas to end her debauched behaviour. She would pawn anything to hand that was of value, and disappear for weeks at a time on a binge. But thieving is a precarious profession, especially if you are drunk. Ellen was frequently in trouble with the police, and Henry was forced to bail her out on several occasions. But he was not permitted to bail her on one occasion, when she went on an all-out binge for a week, which resulted in her being arrested for theft, and she was sentenced to 4 months' imprisonment at Horfield Jail. Henry was left with 6 kids to look after, one of whom was just a baby. When all the money ran out, she would always return to Henry and promise to behave herself. Unfortunately, her promises did not last. Released from prison, Ellen returned to Henry and begged his forgiveness, and once again promised faithfully to behave herself and that things would be different from now on. It is true to say that she did stop stealing, but her drinking habit, if anything, got worse. One time, after the wayward wife had been away for some days, Henry refused to let her back in the house. Ellen kept throwing stones at the windows, shattering the glass, until she was allowed back in. At his wit's end, eventually Henry had the idea of opening a fish and chip shop as a means of keeping her occupied and off the alcohol. For around a month all was well, but it did not last. One evening she was so drunk that she was incapable of frying the fish. Eventually she disappeared from the shop, with every last penny of the takings. With no cash flow, Henry was forced to give up the shop. A month passed and Ellen had not resurfaced. Henry accidentally met her at the horse fair area of the city, and she was in the company of another man. The estranged couple began talking, and Henry told her that he had given up the fish and chip shop and signed over the lease to someone else for £5. She insisted that she owned the shop and was due the money concerned. Peace was somehow declared between the couple, and they moved to the house in Pennywell Road. Ellen requested £3 for some furnishings for their new abode, which her husband handed to her. £2 was spent by Henry on paying off some of his wife's debts. But the domestic arrangement did not last long, and Ellen left Pennywell Road to work in a brothel for 6 months. Just before Christmas she returned, but Henry's attitude was hardening, and he told her that she could have board and lodgings if she behaved herself for 3 months. She refused his offer, and before leaving she exclaimed that she would kill herself. 3 days later she met Henry by accident and begged to return to the house yet again. As Christmas was near, Henry relented and brought her home on the grounds that the children had no objections. We have no records as to their feelings, but the joy of seeing their mother again must have been short-lived, as she pawned the Christmas gifts and even Henry's own suit, storming out of the house in search of booze so she could drink herself senseless. This pattern repeated itself over and over again during the following months. Ellen's behaviour became more manic up to her death on the 4th of May, as she would drink herself into a stupor every day and only return to the family home when the money ran out. Describing his life as a burden, Henry finally snapped after a night of arguments with his wife, during which she had hit him a number of times, as well as throwing anything she could lay her hands on at her husband. Even the children blamed their mother for the extreme actions that her father had taken. They even suggested that Henry's drink problem had been caused by the actions of the mother. At the trial for wilful murder in July, at the Bristol Assizes, the court heard all of the lurid details of the Milstead's relationship and how Ellen had spent all of the household income on debauched behaviour, as well as an unconventional lifestyle. They heard about the efforts that Henry had made to try and persuade his wife to end her wanton ways, and how it was to no avail. Matters had not been helped by the fact that Henry had been ill and off work since Christmas, and was still unemployed right up until the time of the murder. Henry's drinking problem, though not as shocking as that of Ellen, was still bad. The chief warden of Horfield Prison reported to the court that Henry had got so agitated and violent and had caused damage to his cell when the warders refused to get him a pint of beer. For his own safety, he was moved to a padded cell. After that incident, things had calmed down, and the prisoner behaved himself. It was pointed out by a doctor that delirium tremens was one of the many manias arising from alcohol abuse, and it was a possibility that the defendant may not be as mentally stable as a non-drinker, so perhaps was more likely to act on impulse. At the summing up of the case, the judge pointed out that there could be no doubt because of the accused's confession, and that he was the guilty party who was responsible for the death of Ellen Milstead. The jury was asked to consider if there had been any provocation or premeditation, and if it were found to be provocation, could the charge be reduced to manslaughter? It was pointed out, with the exception of the confession, that there was no direct evidence to connect Henry with the crime, only circumstantial. The jury was also asked to consider if Milstead was insane at the time of the murder, and think about how much provocation he may have been under when he attacked his wife. In the end, the jury decided on a verdict of willful murder, but they made a strong recommendation that due to the prolonged period of provocative behaviour of the deceased over a number of years, that mercy be granted. It was not within the judge's remit to think about such a recommendation, although he did agree to pass it on to the relevant authorities, and under the circumstances he had no alternative than to don the black cap and pronounce the death penalty. It would appear that the powers that be heeded the jury's suggestions for mercy, as there is no record of an execution. It is likely that the sentence was commuted, as Milstead was incarcerated for life, as his name appears in the records of Portland Prison in Dorset. What became of the 6 children is also unknown, but it is likely that they were taken in by the Pembrys, as they had family ties, and lived next door in Pennywell Road. So, John, how would you conclude the circumstances surrounding this alcoholic and dysfunctional family and the ensuing crime?
What is extraordinary about this story and others in Vintage Murders is the willingness of people to go to the police and admit their crime. The only real defence was insanity, in which the normal rules of criminal justice were reversed, in that it was the defence that had to prove insanity and not the prosecution. There was no mitigation for helping police with their inquiries. A jury's plea of leniency was just a wish, and the Home Secretary was the only one who commuted a death sentence to one of imprisonment. Would modern society adopt a libertarian attitude to this domestic arrangement? The imprisonment of Henry meant that society had created 6 orphans, but their situation was not even considered. Very difficult to compare £5 in 1900 and its equivalent nowadays, as luxuries in those days would be classified today as everyday items. For instance, chicken is now commonplace and a luxury item back then. There have been reports on this case that he was transported, but transportation had been abolished decades earlier. The same could not be said of his children. Up until the early 1970s, children in orphanages could be sent to parts of the former empire and their identities altered. No wonder that Milstead cried out the words, "Oh dear, my poor children," as the judge donned his black cap.